Hello, everyone. Welcome to our launch party for the long range plan. We will be having some representatives today from our Wisconsin statewide coalitions answer some panel questions today. We are also streaming not only on Zoom, but also on our coalition Facebook pages. And so please have grace with us today. We're trying out some new platforms to allow access to folks beyond just our member programs and things like that. So we hope that if you're attending on Facebook or you're attending on Zoom, we hope that you will be jumping in the chat today on either platforms to put your questions in there. We will have some time at the end to answer some questions that emerge throughout our time together. And then I'll also be trying to moderate them as we go through to see if we can answer questions before the end of our time together as well. So before we jump in, I want to introduce myself. My name is Steph Ortiz. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin as a co-director of prevention and engagement. I'll be your MC today, so I'll be passing it along to other folks who are presenting today, and also note that we will have ASL interpretation throughout our time together. So presenters, feel free to be mindful of that. And we're going to go ahead and get started, y'all. So Akiashia, if you want to bring up our panelists, I'm going to go ahead and jump into our first question. And as you all are bringing folks up, I'll also give you all just a little bit more context on the long range plan, which is for 2023 through 2029, addressing sexual and domestic violence in Wisconsin. So a little context about how we got here before we jump into our first panel question. Y'all, we began this process in 2019. It has been such a labor of love, and we are excited to share it with you all today. But there has been some challenges that have happened from 2019 to now. As many of y'all may be able to guess, the pandemic interrupted our planning process. Back in 2019, we had an original plan to do in-person focus groups with advocates and survivor-serving organizations and things like that. But we had to pivot and we had to adapt to the pandemic. And so in 2022, we revised our process of getting input from stakeholders to make it be virtual sessions. And so what you will notice in the version of the long range plan is there is a lot of input from advocacy organizations and survivors that were gained through these virtual facilitated sessions. And so I want to first thank all the contributors to the long range plan. I know it's been a while since we've had those virtual focus groups and things like that, but we're so thankful and grateful for all of your contributions to the plan. And so in 2020, we held those virtual focus groups, and then some representatives from WCASA and End Abuse, we came together to distill and interpret the data into the report that you all will see us going over and sharing with you all today. So we're going to get right into it, y'all. I want to thank Pa, Monique, and Kelly for being here today as representatives from our coalitions in Wisconsin. I would actually like for you all to introduce yourselves, if that's okay, and then I'll jump into the first question, and we'll lead with you, Monique. So Pa, you want to introduce yourself and pass it along to either Monique or Kelly after?
Yes, thank you, Steph, and hello, everyone. My name is Pa Tao. My pronouns are she, her, hers, or Pa, and I'm the executive director of the Black and Brown Women Power Coalition. And I'll pass it to Monique.
Thank you, Pa. Good afternoon, everyone. Monique Menkins, Executive Director of End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us today. And Kelly.
Great. Hey, everybody. I'm Kelly Mo Lidke. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the interim executive director at the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And I also want to acknowledge that our representative from American Indians Against Abuse was not able to make it today, but they have been involved in the process and how we plan to integrate the long-range plan into the work here in Wisconsin. So more to come from our representatives from AIAA. But we're going to go ahead and get started with this first panelist question, y'all. And so, Monique, if you could go first on this question, can you provide a little history on the long-range plan?
I most definitely can. The long-range plan, we started creating it in the 1980s, so it's been around for quite a while. The last one was from 2014 to 2020. And so we come together every 6 years to create this long-range plan. And as Stephanie said, it is a labor of love. Primarily, the long-range plan has usually been connected to the budget and the legislative process, which then has guided our work in asking for funding. And it's connected to the Governor's Council as well, and DCF. And so we use it for a lot of things to guide our work, and also in asking for funding for programs. For the past 35 years, the long-range plan has been completed or been facilitated. Completion and the creation of the long-range plan has been facilitated by End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin. And this year, after 35 years, it's been created by all 4 coalitions. It was our desire to take this comprehensive approach to the long-range plan and to addressing violence in our state with the thought of no one left behind. And so that is the history of the long-range plan. And we're here in the now.
Thank you, Monique. Kelly or Pa, anything to add as we bring folks into a little bit more historical context of the long-range plan?
Yeah, I think, we're really excited to be included. And I was fortunate to be one of the people that worked with End Abuse on the writing portion as well. And so I just want to, thank everybody who provided feedback, but also just let folks know that we're here together. And I know it's been a rough while, especially the last few months. And so I want to acknowledge that. But we're here together. We're recommitting through all of these challenges and through some, I'm sure, some other growing pains that we're going to have in this collaboration. We're really committed to working together to do what's best for all survivors in Wisconsin. So just thank you to our partners as we figure this out, right? As we figure this out together.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And I just want to add that, we're really excited at the Black and Brown Women Power Coalition to be able to start out as a new nonprofit in 2019, right, and jump right into the long-range plan along with End Abuse and WCASA. So really excited for the opportunity to collaborate, but really the opportunity to create a long-range plan that can encompass all survivors in Wisconsin. So I want to thank both coalitions for that, but also for our partners who has been able to work with us throughout this process as well.
And I want to add, thank you, Pa. One thing I want to add is that I love how we didn't create this long-range plan in a vacuum. It involved the state came together. We got advocates and directors from different programs from around the state, both DB and SA. We targeted the most marginalized advocates who represent the most marginalized, and we got information that way. And so we really looked at, and we were really intentional. And so you see these 4 coalitions here, and yet it's everyone. This is our plan. This is our statewide plan.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate you sharing a little bit more context, historical context of the long-range plan. It's exciting to see all of us in one space and really just take this collective approach to the work that we know needs to happen in Wisconsin on behalf of all survivors. So thank you all for that. And so my next panelist question, we're going to start off with you, Kelly. How does this long-range plan differ from previous plans? And so we got a little bit into that. And so can you speak to that a little more?
Of course, I think the most obvious, right, is what's already been addressed, is that it's a collaboration of all 4 coalitions. And it's important to restate that, right? Because as Monique said, for 35 years, that wasn't the case. And so I think that's a really exciting thing with how we've gotten to this point, but also how it moves forward from here, because we don't envision this as a sit on the shelf kind of kind of thing. So we're going to, also as four coalitions move forward with this plan, and Pa and others are going to get into that a little bit more. But I think, the four of us endorsing this and being here together is really, really important. And another kind of obvious, but significant change, and why WCASA is here specifically, is that this long range plan includes sexual assault for the first time. And so I'm really happy to say that it's not just added on, like it's not just tacked on and DV and SA, right, as sometimes can happen for sexual assault services, but it also emerged as one of the primary concepts and one of the primary areas through the feedback with partners. And I remember Steph even saying that in our writing process, that was one of the things that just kept coming up to the top, that kept coming up as a priority. So we really feel like sexual assault is included, right? Not added on. It really is included. And as the Sexual Assault Coalition, selfishly, right, that's really important. Was really important part of the process for us. But I think what might be the most important change of all with this is really just the conversations and the work we did around the broader purpose of this long range plan. As Monique said earlier, oftentimes it had maybe been focused on budget or focused on maybe more specific things. We really, through this process and through your feedback, we had lots of conversations about how we wanted this to be a larger framework of our work overall. And then those other pieces can develop and grow from it. But it was really this broader framework of our collective efforts to end violence in Wisconsin. And these efforts and this plan center the needs of those most marginalized and impacted by violence, which includes Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQ and Two-Spirit communities. We are committed to, and we're committed to the understanding that we're not going to end violence unless we end all forms of oppression. And hopefully that is foundational in this plan and foundational in our work as we move it forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelly. Monique or Pa, anything to add there on how this long-range plan differs from previous plans?
I just want to add that, I've been in this work for a very long time. I think my 13th, 14th year, working in gender justice, and have seen the long range plan a couple of times in its different version over the years. And it really is the first long range plan that really centers people who's most impacted, right? So I really want to highlight that, and we really want to uplift that in the space that we're sharing today.
Thank you, Pa. Appreciate that.
And I would agree with Pa in that it looked at all the intersections, right? And so people have multiple identities, and it honors the whole survivor, it honors the person and who they are. So that once again, we are taking this comprehensive approach, and we are honoring who they are and not leaving anyone behind.
Thank you all. I appreciate that. Yeah, as someone who has been part of the facilitator process and the focus groups that were virtual, I can really say that it was a joy to be in space with so many advocates and folks that were representing survivor serving organizations in those input sessions. It was so important for me to see all of your voices really be elevated and amplified throughout the process. So I really hope that you all see your input centered and integrated into the long range plan that we'll go into. And so I'm going to pivot to our last panelist question, y'all. As we mentioned, this long range plan is different, right? We wanted to see all of ourselves as part of it. We wanted to read it and see ourselves reflected in it in a way in which we too are responsible for integrating what we see and what is written into the long range plan into our everyday lives and to our roles within advocacy organizations and things like that. And so my next question, and we'll start this one off with you, Pa, is how will coalitions and programs use the long range plan?
Yes, thank you, Steph. So I think first for coalitions, right, is really using this long range plan to really inform funding at a statewide level. and to really make sure that funding goes back into the areas of priorities that we have outlined in the long range plan through working with different groups throughout the state of Wisconsin. But not only that, like really advocate for funding with like state funders and policies, right? Really looking at how different policies may come through that could potentially impact the work that we do, and really using a long range plan to also do that. And then lastly, like really using this plan to really center our collaboration together as coalition. It is a living and breathing document, and we're committed to that. And so I think in every aspect of how we're going to be moving forward as coalitions and working together, that this long range plan will really center us and ground us in how we're doing this work. So highlighting that. And then for programs, really to guide your work in your communities, use this plan to also advocate for funding on a local level. Use it with your local health department to really get them to see the priorities that's also important in the work that you're doing in your own local communities, right? And then also engaging partners with the work that you're doing. Really use this plan to engage them, to advocate for your programs, yourself, or the folks that you're working with, and to really support your efforts on important community issues, right? And so, again, use the plan as a grounding point, as a white paper, if you may, to really just advocate for the programs that you're working for and the survivors that you're working with at your level. But for us, again, just really using this document to ground us collectively, not just with coalitions or as coalitions, but also as communities across Wisconsin.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pa. Kelly or Monique, anything to add on how you envision coalitions or programs using the long range plan? Oh, you're muted, Monique, but I see you talking.
Thank you.
Sure
I
thing.
think Pa said it beautifully, and that it's going to inform our work through policy and advocacy. And it's also going to give us some direction and training and how what we offer to the programs around the state so that they are prepared to carry out this plan. You have to be able to have some kind of apparatus and state in place to carry out our goals. And so it's given us a great roadmap of what we need to do as well.
Thank you, Monique.
Yeah, and I just want to add, especially when you're talking about policy advocacy and funding, I'm in DC right now, as is Jenna, who you're going to hear from in a minute. And it already is guiding our work, right? It already is helping us set those priorities, both within the state, but also in our advocacy at the national level. And so we want to see this used by us as coalitions, but also by local programs. And so that's what I'm most excited about, I think, in this whole thing is while we're setting this out as a framework and we're talking about how folks might use it, we don't really know, right? Like what might come up for programs and what might come up for us as coalitions. And so I think we're entering this part of the process, and we've sometimes called it like long range plan 2.0 or phase 2, with a lot of openness and anticipation, right? Like we're excited about what it might mean for us as coalitions, for us as individuals working in these coalitions, but as well like what it might look like statewide. So I'm just like kind of excited to see what happens, and like some willingness to just kind of be along for the ride on that too, to see where we might end up.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Pa and Monique. We've actually got a question that feels right to just bring into the space now, if I may, y'all. So we got a question from our Zoom audience. Hi, will this long-range plan reach the organizations that are not getting state or federal funding? Will you open collaborative MOU to really help survivors across the state? Anyone want to offer any reflections to that question?
Speaking of for end abuse, as a survivor and victims advocate, we and as the state coalition for domestic violence, we serve the entire state. And so if someone reaches out to us for support or collaboration, we are definitely on board and are looking forward to working. Once again, we're trying to take this approach to anti-violence and it's not just us, it involves the community and people that are really have their feet on the ground that are really doing the work. And so we welcome that kind of collaboration.
I also think it's important to note, like, we also acknowledge the barriers that have long existed to accessing funding, particularly for those most impacted by violence, right? Those working with marginalized communities and those most harmed. And so I think that, yes, I think we want this broader vision for this plan, right? To be able to not only include people, but break down some of those barriers that have long existed. And I think this plan is one way for us to start having those conversations with funders, as Pa already talked about, and advocate for funding and advocate for connecting with, right, those who don't receive and haven't received state and federal funding.
Yeah, and just to echo what Kelly and Monique already said, like we welcome working with anyone, whether you are federally funded or state funded, to do this work, right? Because we know that collectively it takes all of us to add value to Wisconsin. It's not just funded programs, it's the teachers in the classroom, it's it's the everyday person that can really help drive this plan as well, to really make sure that we are centering folks who are most impacted and uplifting the priorities in the plan. So absolutely welcome any collaboration efforts from folks across the state either way.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Zoom attendee, for offering your question to the panel here today. I think as we wrap up the panel, just some closing comments on this portion is some phrases or some things that we hear in the movement oftentimes is the revolution starts at home, right? And the revolution will not be funded. Right. And so like for those of you that may be present today that are maybe not connected with an advocacy organization in your local community, now's the chance to look over the long range plan and find ways to be in connection with your local service provider or your survivor serving organizations in your local community. And then also know that there may be things in the plan that you can begin to integrate into your own life, even as individuals. We hope that as you're reviewing over the long range plan that you get uncomfortable, right? Because I think that's a sign of growth, that there may be some input from advocates and survivor serving organizations in there that are asking us to shift our lens, to shift our worldview and how we're approaching our work in Wisconsin. And so we hope you have the chance to read through it and ideally connect with a local organization in your community. I know all the coalitions here today have like membership programs that we can offer you all, whether you're funded by the federal or state government or not. And so feel free to reach out to any of our websites to see more about how to become a member of our organizations, or even beyond that, as Monique mentioned, we're here to serve everyone. And have technical assistance provided to all. So thank you, panelists, so much for answering our questions for those in attendance today. What we're going to do now is we're going to pivot to bring in Ian and Jenna up, at least vocally, to go over our website. And so we have a website that's dedicated to the long range plan. And so Ian and Jenna are going to go over that vocally, and then we'll keep our ASL interpreter on front and center next to our website for accessibility. So I'll pass it to you, Ian and Jenna.
Hello, hi, I just unmuted myself. So my name is Jenna Gormal. I'm the Director of Public Policy at End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin. I've worked at End Abuse for about 4 years now. I used to work at a local program for around the same time. And I've been part of the long range design team since I started End Abuse. So it has been a long process. So that's a little bit about me. We'll go into the recommendations and some of the context for the long range plan in a second, but I'll pass it over to Ian.
Thanks, Jenna. Hi, everyone. My name is Ian Henderson. I'm the Policy and Systems Director at the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I've been here for just under, 16 years now. And prior to coming to the coalition, spent my career after graduating from law school providing direct legal services to survivors of both domestic abuse and sexual violence. So happy to be here talking with you today about the long range plan.
Thanks, Ian. So as it has already been mentioned, in late 2020, our team kind of convened 4 virtual input sessions with directors and advocates from member programs throughout the state. And we asked 2 primary questions. The first was, what are the changes, trends, paradigms, and approaches emerging in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault? And then the second was, what innovative approaches would create a Wisconsin that centers the strength of survivors and supports their liberation? So we started off the sessions by reflecting on the domestic violence and sexual assault movements using the image of a wave. And I'm going to ask someone who is brilliant at tech to bring up the long range planning website as I speak. And so we have this image of a wave as a starting point to really identify the changes, the trends and paradigms and approaches that are disappearing, established, emerging, on the horizon, and the undertow in our fields. And if you scroll down just a little bit, you can see that it was a very interactive approach. Perfect. So it was a very interactive process, and it generated a lot of ideas, a lot of wonderful ideas. And so what we did was we gathered all of the information on this original document, and we had a few other sessions where we went into some deeper dives where we grouped and distilled the ideas down into what became some priority areas. So 6 priority areas. And then I'll just have you click on the home page for me, please. Thank you. And the homepage, if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll get those interpretations and context. Perfect, just there is great. So one thing that the design team noted upon reviewing all of the information that we received from advocates and directors across the state was that it was missing a lot of contextual information. And advocates spoke about transformative justice, racism and oppression, funding disparities, and intersectionality. And there was such a rich discussion around these themes that we wanted to make sure that context was also captured so that the specific recommendations in the plan made a lot more sense. So that led us to do a couple of things. So first, we created a section of the plan that dove into the context. And that's what we're going to go over first of all. So you'll see 3 of the 6 themes up in front of you right now. The first is demand intersectionality in our work. So as mentioned a little bit at the beginning in the panel, intersectionality really challenges us to broaden our focus beyond just domestic violence and sexual assault to really understand the layers of oppression that a survivor might experience. And because, if we account for only one aspect of identity, like sex or gender, to inform how a survivor is offered support, we really fail to comprehensively address violence. So applying an intersectional lens necessitates, for example, that we broaden our policy advocacy to all areas that intersect with sexual and domestic violence and that ultimately impact survivors. And in addressing those root causes to end violence long term, we can do that while also using an intersectional lens as a daily practice with survivors in our service provision. The next one here is, I'll pass over to Ian.
Great. Thanks, Jenna. The next one is confront racism and oppression. And these themes, as you probably will see going forward, very much relate to one another. So, right, Jenna just talked about the focus on demanding intersectionality in our work. To do that, right, the context that we developed around this particular theme was that intersectionality must be understood through a framework of white supremacy, right? When we looked at white supremacy absolutely impacts the anti-sexual violence and anti-domestic abuse, the anti-violence movements broadly, right? Historically, our movement has been led almost exclusively by white cisgender women. And that has led Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led efforts underfunded and often unrecognized for their work and leadership. And it has, in fact, pushed many of those folks out of the movement altogether. So one of the ways that we must confront racism and oppression within our movement is to re-examine the relationships that our movement has had with systems that continue to harm historically marginalized communities, right? That includes the criminal legal system. And we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But I think one of the things I want to just touch on quickly here is many of you may remember that back in probably now 3 years ago, right around this time, our respective coalitions joined a national letter called the Moment of Truth letter that was authored in response really to the murder of George Floyd, that really looked at the anti-violence movement's focus on systems that have caused harm, particularly the criminal legal system. And really, when we began working on taking this, all the rich data that was gathered as part of the process and trying to develop the plan and really write the plan, we wanted to make sure we were looking at the Moment of Truth letter, which we said, again, 3 years ago, right, was going to be something that we didn't just sign on to and then put away, but that was going to serve as a touchstone for our work. And so I just wanted to bring that piece into this as well. And that very much was part of something we looked at when writing the plan. So the next theme is centering Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I'm going to pass that back to Jenna.
Thank you. So again, we're saying this over and over again, but I think it does bear repeating. When we do center those most marginalized, not only do we overcome barriers for Black and Indigenous and people of color, we also improve responses for all survivors. And BIPOC folks are disproportionately impacted by sexual assault and domestic violence, which includes facing really unique barriers to reporting and seeking services after experiencing violence. And this came up time and again in our sessions where folks were saying that we have relied historically on a criminal legal system that is not safe for the vast majority of survivors. And so as we make recommendations, we need to be mindful of that and figuring out new ways so we can meet all of the survivors in our state. The next one, I'll pass it back to Ian so you can just scroll down and touch more to get those next three. Thanks, Ka.
Great. And the next one, embedding transformative justice principles into our systems work. And really that is looking at the desire to look for accountability outside of a criminal legal system that dehumanizes people through punishment, right? That is, again, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, examining our movement's historical focus on really that criminal legal system as the only means of addressing sexual violence and addressing domestic abuse, which from an anti-sexual violence perspective always seems kind of strange when you think about it, right? One of the things when we're talking about sexual violence and doing that community education, we say most survivors don't report to the criminal justice system, right? To the criminal legal system. And yet that stood in contrast to most of our efforts were focused on fixing or reforming that system. And that really, we're needing to shift away from that, right? And to build in and to acknowledge that transformative approaches and the desire to find accountability outside of the criminal legal system, right? Criminal legal system has historically disregarded those transformative approaches, which again have long been a focus in BIPOC communities. And so we need models of survivor-defined justice that center safety outside of the criminal legal system. And the other thing I'll touch on with respect to transformative justice is a focus on decriminalizing survival. Black women historically have been, and girls have been the target for criminal legal responses, particularly when defending themselves. Here in Wisconsin, we have the case of Crystal Kaiser, who is a Black woman who is now facing a first-degree intentional homicide charge for defending herself against her trafficker. That case and others like it, we see an unequal application of self-defense laws where white people do not face criminal liability for defending themselves, where Black, Indigenous, and people of color do, and particularly Black girls. So I'm going to continue and shift gears to the next theme, which is prioritizing sexual assault services. One of the things that our plan and our movement has noticed is that the failure to recognize the distinction between sexual assault and domestic violence has negatively impacted sexual assault work and survivors. And I think what our movement has done very well is to look at places where the two issues are similar, and undoubtedly there are very similar underpinnings to both domestic violence and sexual assault when we talk about the abuse of power and violations of bodily autonomy. However, to understand one of the things I think that our movement, the distinctions that have not been completely understood as well, is that understanding sexual violence outside of the intimate partner context, right? And that failure to recognize the distinction has created funding disparities at both the state and federal levels that have created a gap in meaningful and distinct services for sexual assault programming and sexual assault survivors. Oftentimes, we've seen sexual assault be an add-on, or that there's a lack of organizational infrastructure to support those services. And so one of the recommendations and one of the focuses of this plan is to increase funding for sexual violence and to prioritize sexual violence services. And again, also bringing in the recognition that bodily autonomy is a key concept in addressing and preventing sexual violence, which is certainly connected to the broader reproductive health access and reproductive justice movements. And I'll pass it to Jenna for the final theme of redefining the role of the advocate.
Thanks. So as Ian mentioned, when we think about domestic violence and sexual assault work, it includes governmental funding, and that does shape service delivery. So what came up time and again was this reliance on funding limits how services are defined and prioritized, which can result in a prescribed kind of one-size-fits-all approach that ultimately doesn't serve all survivors. And these limitations, can result in survivors, particularly those not in immediate crisis, being turned away or not seeking help in the first place because their circumstances don't fit the crisis-based nature of the organization. And despite the grassroots origins of the domestic violence and sexual assault movement, advocates talked about the fact that the professionalization of the work ultimately inhibited comprehensive approaches to violence, prevention, intervention, and healing. So advocates spoke a lot about this kind of need to deprofessionalize, in some ways, the movement and challenge this narrative that folks often face of what is a good and worthy victim. So that's the context for the long range plan, and we wanted that to be out front and center on the plan because it really does help understand how we came to arrive at the priorities and recommendations that we'll go into next. So if you could navigate to the top section there, it'll say priorities and recommendations. If I can see it, there we go. Perfect. And so we're going to start with this priority area 1, which is services. And this was the largest priority area, which is probably no surprise, right? Because we're talking to advocates and directors who are very focused on what's going on in your services. And so again, if we had all the time in the world, we would deep dive into every single one of these recommendations, but I am just going to highlight a couple that were interesting to me and to us as a writing team. So one of the ones that came up a lot was expanding services beyond the false dichotomy of victims and abusers. And you can see one of the specific recommendations there is to provide treatment and healing services for those who have caused harm. And I think this is an interesting point that really highlights what the long range plan is all about. It's where we recognize that some organizations do work with folks who cause harm and some don't. Some are inhibited from doing so because of funding. So this recommendation doesn't necessarily mean that domestic violence or sexual assault programs must adopt these services. They can be separate. They can be part of your services. But the point is to highlight that if we are going to end violence, we need to address harm doers. So these services have to exist. So that was an interesting point. And a little bit further down, recognizing victimization across the lifespan. This was another point that advocates would bring up repeatedly, that we all operate in kind of crisis-based models, and that is typically what is funded, and we have little funding, right? So we are kind of trying to prioritize in some ways the survivors that are coming to our doors, and so we focus on crisis intervention work, but there is a recognition that there are a whole host of survivors who don't meet that crisis-based definition, and we're missing them and we're failing those survivors. So there's a need to move beyond that. A couple others just a little down, and remove rigid policies and practices that create barriers to healing and justice. A couple here that were interesting. One, I'll mention increasing mobile services via outreach, varied hours, virtual options. And again, if you operate or work at a program that's doing outreach, then that's fantastic. You're already doing that, and this just goes to show that we're all in different stages across the state and how we operate. And the beauty of this plan, I think, is that it is a framework for folks that you may be advanced in some sections. Maybe you're applying all of these recommendations already in this section, but you have some ways to go in others. And so I think this just reiterates for me that this plan is a kind of guiding framework moving us all forward together. So I will pass it on to Ian.
Great. Thank you, Jenna. Yeah, if you could just scroll down a little bit, we'll talk about prevention. What's that?
Oh, I thought it was me. It was me next, but you can go for prevention. Sorry.
Okay, I'll go with prevention, and then Jenna, you can go back. We're navigating the website while in different places, so thanks for bearing with us, everyone. Prevention. I'll just be really brief on this one. I think really what this obviously prevention is key for all of our organizations and a key foundation of the anti-violence movement. But really, what we want to do is build on the foundation that understands anti-oppression work as primary prevention. And I think ways that we've seen this crop up recently is in our organization's responses and support and following the lead of our partners who are opposing policies at the local and state level regarding preventing transgender girls from participating in sports, or curriculum censorship related to LGBTQ plus youth, or critical race theory, right? And really framing our messaging and responses to those harmful policies as one as harming sexual violence prevention efforts, because we can't end sexual violence without ending all forms of oppression. And so you'll see some specific recommendations relating and incorporating that framework as well. Okay, Jenna?
Thank you. And so, sorry, I'm going to ask you to go up to priority area number 2, thank you, which is culturally specific work. So a couple there, reaching those most marginalized, again, came up. So ensuring that there is meaningful access to services across all identities through making sure that there's translated materials, warm referrals between organizations, and good relationships between programs. So really encouraging us as service providers to be in collaboration with each other for the benefit of survivors. And investing in BIPOC-led and culturally specific programs. So we want to direct our funders to remove existing barriers to funding for culturally specific programs, and to ensure that we're offering substantial, non-restricted, flexible funding for services and for prevention work, which is historically underfunded or unfunded. And I will pass it back to Ian, I believe.
Thank you. If you can scroll down. Yeah, we can go past prevention. Oh, statewide infrastructure. I think that was you again, Jenna. But
I could dive into statewide infrastructure, and I'll just go ahead and do that. So statewide infrastructure, a couple here. This is thinking about the state as a whole. So advancing public policy initiatives based on the long range plan. As Kelly mentioned at the very start of the call, I'm currently in DC right now, and we are using the long range plan as an advocacy tool. We're focused on the intersectional issues, including racial, economic, and reproductive justice, and making sure that our public policy initiatives are really reflective of what's in here. And then another incredibly important one, and I think the plan this plan could ultimately fail if we don't adopt this recommendation, is that we have to foster a movement to end violence through the collaboration of the 4 coalitions. So all of us are on this call today: AIAA, Black and Brown Women Power Coalition, End Abuse, and the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and our primary funders, DCF, DOJ, and DHS. We have to make a commitment to the recommendations in this plan. We have to work together. This will only work if our funders are reading what the domestic violence and sexual assault advocates are saying that they need, what programs are saying that they need, and what survivors are ultimately needing right now, so that funders can look at their grants. What grants are they releasing? Does it actually fit domestic violence organizations and sexual assault organizations needs at the moment? So that is one commitment that we need to make, and a movement that we absolutely need to foster in collaboration together.
Okay, if we can scroll down, I'm undoubtedly those last ones will be mine. Yes, there we go. Systems work. This kind of builds on what I talked about when we were going through the contextual framework and the 6 themes, right? I talked about transformative justice. You'll see recommendations specifically looking at seeking alternatives to the criminal legal system, both in terms of the domestic violence movement, looking at the mandatory arrest. With respect to the sexual assault movement, that we would be looking at, broadening our focus on multidisciplinary response teams that aren't so criminal legal system focused, like SARTs, the sexual assault response teams. At the same time, right, we want to be building those transformative justice focus into our work. We also know that we're not fully in the transformative world yet, right? We have kind of feet in both worlds. So there are still survivors who are engaging with the criminal legal system. So we are still going to look at improving system responses for survivors. It's just that, as I said, right, we need to move away from exclusive focus on that system as the be-all, end-all for survivors, because we know it's not. Again, looking at redefining multidisciplinary teams beyond criminal legal system, and again, that focus on building in and fostering transformative approaches that look for accountability outside the criminal legal system. And if we can scroll down a little bit more, and yes, funding, and Jenna talked about this as well. And so not surprisingly, priorities around increasing funding through sexual assault through existing grant programs, and prioritizing sexual violence programming and anti-sexual violence programming and discretionary grants, increasing funding for primary prevention, and absolutely increasing funding for culturally specific work and culturally specific programs. So yeah, that's really a very quick overview of the long-range plan, but now you've kind of seen an overview of the context and some of the specific recommendations, and Pa really talked really nicely how we hope folks will use the long-range plan, but I really appreciate the opportunity to share that with you all today. And so I will pass it back to Steph, I believe.
Hello, everyone, again. This is Steph. I just want to give many thanks to Jenna and Ian for taking us through what will be our website that will be available to all. We're hoping as early as next week, folks will be able to access the website directly, and we'll be sure to send out access information to everyone. We did get a question that came in that I'm hoping we can save to the end. I recognize we're coming to the top of the hour, everyone. So if you do have to disconnect, please know that our time together is being recorded. We're going to go over time and still move on to our next session of our launch today, which is really just talking about next steps, right? We just revealed and shared with you all a little bit of the background and how we got started, the historical context. And then again, Jenna and Ian took us through some of the recommendation and the context for those things. And so we wanted to sort of close with providing some things to consider, some questions to consider. And so Ka, if we can bring you on to move us through this next portion of our presentation today. And then after that, we'll leave a little open time for question and answer. So I did see one of the questions come in, but I'm hoping we'll save that until after your portion, Ka, next steps. So Ka, if you want to introduce yourself and share with us a little bit of what we can expect. Like, what do we do now? Where do we go from here now that we've just been introduced to the long-range plan?
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Steph. Hi, everyone. My name is Ka. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Sexual Assault Program Director at Black and Brown Women Power Coalition. And so really this portion is to talk about not just our commitment to the long-range plan, but really to ask and give you all the time and also the ability to commit to this plan too. And so for us, as the 4 coalitions, we've really talked and have are committed to using our positionality with funders. We've kind of talked about that today, but really talking about the priorities of our long-range plan to support organizations that are doing anti-violence work that really aligns with the priorities that we have and that advocates and organizations have spoken about and have agreed upon. We know that this document may feel really heavy or feel like a really big task to incorporate into the programming that we have already. But as coalitions, we are really looking forward to creating, holding space, and maybe a physical space beyond a virtual space, maybe in this upcoming fall, where we can invite folks to co-create commitments for their own programs and the expectations that you all have for us as coalitions. We want to give organizations time not only to digest the document, but to see where they're at with the priorities that are outlined in the long-range plan, and come back to us or with your own organizations and discuss how programs have already been doing that work, any best practices that folks have, and how to share that knowledge amongst the entire state. Like many individuals have said before, this is going to be a collective effort in order for this to work. And I think for me, and I know that the four coalitions can back me up on this as well, is that, and that we've spoken about before, is that the topics that are included in the long-range plan and our priorities are not new to queer and BIPOC communities who have been doing this work long before it was formalized through the long-range plan and through this process. And we are honoring that work has been done currently with BIPOC and queer programs, but that this information, again, is not new to them. It's important that this information does not stay in a silo with just directors or with just advocates, but as a collective. So as a whole coalition, we are really asking folks to review the long-range plan individually and with all of your staff, identifying areas where your work is already fitting into the long-range plan, and then identifying needs or what support you need in order to or how to integrate that into the long-range plan or integrate the long-range plan into your current programming. Some questions that I think we crafted in the hopes that you're all able to ask yourself and your teams are the same ones that we have been asking ourselves and that we are also committed to asking as we move forward. And there's four questions that we're kind of asking. How do we integrate the long-range plan into our work? Or maybe how have we done so in the past? How do we incorporate it into the director spaces that we create? How do we hold one another accountable to these commitments? And then lastly, what is our process of accountability? I think these four questions are really important to consider as we move forward into these kind of next steps or commitments in the future. And so, like I said before, we are really committed to this, and our commitment means that we are going to hold space in the future as folks are digesting this document to continue answering questions and to create what the future looks like as we incorporate this into our programming as coalitions, as well as our programming with you all as well to provide technical assistance and support. So that's all I have, and I will send it back to Steph.
Thank you so much, Ka. Thanks, everyone. And so it looks like we have at least one question that has emerged in the chat on Zoom. Folks, if you have questions for any of our panels, our folks in attendance today, feel free to send them via chat. If you're connected on any of our social media comments, our social media platforms, we are able to see your comments. So if you're connected that way, feel free to add your questions into the comment section. And similarly, if you're connected via Zoom, feel free to send your question in the chat and we'll bring them up here. Our first question that has come up from one of our attendees is, this plan, as described in your presentation, is very much aligned with the State Health Improvement Plan out of the Department of Health Services, DHS. How can we at DHS best promote and support your work? And so if we could bring our our executive directors from our representative coalitions back on today. And if any of you all have a response to this first question, feel free to jump in.
I can start. Thanks for the question and thanks for your interest. DHS is a funding partner with WCASA, as well as funding local programs in a variety of capacities, and specifically rape prevention education, which some in the group might be familiar with. But I think that this is what we're going to be exploring, right? This is going to be our advocacy with funders, is to say, how can we do this together? What does it look like? How can you elevate survivors' voices? How can you elevate BIPOC voices in your process, right? And so I think it's about finding out how we support each other. What does it mean for our work and in sexual assault and domestic violence? But also, what does it look like more broadly within DHS, and how can we collaborate and talk about these important topics in other spaces as well? And so I'm happy to hear that there's alignment. Obviously, with that, there can be, more collaborative efforts and synergy around what that might look like moving forward. But we look forward. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I look forward to exploring that with DHS and other funders who might be joining us today.
Thank you, Kelly. Power, Monique, anything to offer to that question before I jump on to the next?
I agree with everything that Kelly said. We don't know, it's still new, and yet let's explore it. What our hope is that these changes, this transformation, stands the test of time, that it stands beyond us, and it's going to require us to collaborate with other partners. And so we're open to it, and we're figuring it out. So.
Thank you, Monique.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Pivoting to our next question, y'all. What is the timeline for making the webpage live, and how has this plan impacted the current asks for the budget?
I wonder if maybe we could pull in Jenna or Ian to help with that, specifically about the webpage. Jenna's been leading those efforts.
There you are. You're muted, Jenna.
Hi. Yes, I can answer. Yeah, the webpage question. We will hopefully have the webpage live. Today is currently Tuesday, correct? So we will most likely have the webpage live potentially as early as tomorrow, but definitely by the end of the week, Friday, and we can send that out to folks by Friday. Just had a couple of glitches that happened today because technology will do that to us. So we will have that sent out as soon as possible. And then thinking about budgets and how we're using this as an advocacy tool, I think it's just a really great advocacy tool to demonstrate what the needs are, right? When we talk with legislators, they want to know what is going on, what are the issue areas, what are the problems that are happening in our state, and what can we do to address them. And here we have this beautiful document, and I promise it is a beautiful document, and an even more gorgeous webpage when you see it. And we are able to use that as a tool to say, look, this is what folks who are in your constituents, this is what they're saying that they need.
Thank you, Jenna. Appreciate it. All right. Let's see if there's any more questions coming up. Let's see. I'm not seeing any questions coming in, y'all. Feel free to send them our way. And even after our time together today, right? As you jump into the long range plan, start processing it. As Carl mentioned previously, we want to give folks time to digest everything. It's a lot to take in. And so questions may emerge even outside of this space today. But we certainly wanted to go live and do as best as we can to give you all an overview and hopefully, get you excited about reading it and finding ways to start integrating it into your work. And so, with that, I think I'll sort of transition to our closing today. And really, just many thanks, much gratitude for everyone in the background making all of our tech possible today. We're all trying new platforms and things today to make sure that this is accessible. I want to thank you all of the folks in attendance via Zoom and following on our social media platforms. We appreciate you being here today and learning more about the long range plan. We look forward to hearing more from you all as you dive into what it has to offer you all. And we look forward to continued discussions on the long range plan. You can reach out to anybody here on the call, Kelly, Monique, Pa, if you want to put your emails into the comment section so folks have your direct emails, that will be great. We're here to see what you all have in terms of reflections as you begin to dive in. And please look forward to more information regarding the spaces that we will hope to create, ideally in person, as Ka mentioned, to have more facilitated discussion on what the long range plan looks like in our work collectively as we move forward. And so with that, again, to the readers of the report, which we hope will be all of you, we have the power to transform our communities by finding opportunities to move these recommendations forward in our personal, professional, and political spheres of influence. And really, survivor safety, liberation, their lives are all at stake. So it's up to us collectively, really, right? And so I thank you all for attending today, and we look forward to more conversations around implementation of the long range plan. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you all being here today and tuning in.